There are many ways of writing down the tones of Mandarin beyond the standard tone marks. Which are they, and what pros and cons do they offer for learners? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about tones, but we're not going to do it in the usual way about the actual spoken tones, but instead talk about how we write tones down and how they can be represented in text. The first thing I want to mention before we get started is that, of course, writing something down is not the same as saying it, and reading it is not the same thing as hearing it. And this is something we explored in episode 38, so please refer to that if you think that Pinyin and pronunciation are the same thing. That the sounds of a language and the symbols we use to write them down are different can also be seen in the fact that we have many different ways of writing down the sounds, but they are the same sounds. So for example, we have Hanyu Pinyin and we also have Zhuyin Fuhao, along with several other systems that we can use to write the sounds of Mandarin. When it comes to tones, there is one standard way to write them for each system, but there are also many other ways of writing down the tones. In this week's episode, we'll look at several different ways of writing the tones and discuss what pros and cons they have for learners of the language. Of course, this is a podcast episode, so I'm going to talk about ways of writing things, and mostly that works well, but there are cases where it might be easier to go to the article on Hacking Chinese to see a concrete example, but I'll do my best to make sure it works in audio-only format too. So the 7 different ways of writing down tones that we are going to talk about are tone marks, tone numbers, Zhao tone numerals, IPA tone letters, color, 国语罗马字, and total orthographic pinyin. Some of these are by their very nature restricted to a certain transcription system, and others are merely associated with one by tradition. For example, the tonal spelling in 国语罗马字 can't be used with zhuyin, but color can be used in combination with any other system, including characters themselves. Furthermore, you can use the IPA tone letters with normal pinyin, but this is very unusual, and most people use IPA for the syllables as well if they are going to use it for the tones. But there's nothing that stops you from combining in that way. In this week's episode, I'm not going to talk so much about the transcription and romanization systems that exist to write down pronunciation in general, such as Pinyin and Zhuyin that I've mentioned, but I have written a series of articles about this already called Learning to Pronounce Mandarin with Pinyin, Zhuyin, and IPA, and I've put a link in the description. So let's get started with the first way of writing down tones, tone marks. For students, the most familiar way to represent tones is using tone marks. These are diacritic marks put above the main vowel in each syllable. The marks are mostly visual representation of the tone, but you have to remember that tone change, tone sande, is not shown. So for example, in 想要, to want, 想, is a low tone, 想要. But in 想法, idea or way of thinking, 想 is a rising tone, 想法. This is normally not shown, so you have to apply these rules yourself. This also goes for the characters bu and I, which also undergo tone change, but if you look in a dictionary, they will always be written with a 4th tone and a 1st tone, respectively. So what are the pros for learners with tone marks? Well, first, it's a direct and clear link between the symbol and the tone height, in most cases, except the tone sound we just discussed. And that means that you can just look at the tone mark and you kind of get an idea of how this is supposed to be pronounced. A mark that goes up means that you're supposed to rise, and a mark that goes down means that you're supposed to fall. And because this system is very transparent, the symbols are also easy to remember. It also has the additional pro of being one of the most commonly used systems. This is a standard in Hanyu Pinyin, and it's also used in Zhuyin Fuhao, so that means that basically everybody knows how to use this system. That in itself doesn't mean that it is a good system though, and it certainly has some drawbacks. So first, it's hard to type, and I mean obviously not typing characters here, but I mean if you want to type Pinyin with tone marks, you need some additional software or support in your operating system of some kind, and this means that it's not easily accessible for everybody. In addition, like I mentioned in passing earlier, these marks usually show the underlying form, so it doesn't show the surface form, i.e. what happens after tone change, so you need to be mindful of that as well. In most cases, this is not really a problem though, but when it is a problem, you need to use some other system. Before we get to a system that can deal with that though, we're going to look at another one which is very common, and that is simply tone numbers. So here we just write a number after each syllable to denote which tone it is. Is it the first tone, second tone, third tone, or fourth tone? Usually this is written in superscript, but you sometimes see it written just with a normal number as well. This is also the most commonly used way of talking about tones, including in Chinese. So, well, I just use the words first, second, third, and fourth tone, and those numbers are associated with those tones. This also works in Chinese, and this is the way most native speakers talk about tones when they do that. And that's 第一声, so tone number 1, 第二声, 第三声, and 第四声. And then we have 轻声 for the neutral tone. And while that's not really a number, you can ascribe it number 0 or 5 depending on preference. These numbers at least used to be common in writing as well, so in Wade-Giles, which is the system that preceded Pinyin and was dominant for quite a long time, uses superscript numbers in this way. I also want to mention that in textbooks and research papers about phonology or phonetics, these numbers are also used when talking about tones in general, often with tones abbreviated to just a T, so T1 for first tone, T2, T3, T4, and so on. So one of the main reasons why people use this today is that it's very fast and it's easy to type. Just hitting a number is much easier than including some weird diacritic mark. It's also rather common, so you don't risk people misunderstanding what you mean, which can be the case with some of the later methods I'm going to talk about. But this is rather common, and everybody knows what a first tone is and what a fourth tone is, and they can figure out that that's what the numbers mean, even if they are not used to seeing them written like that. There are some significant drawbacks here though. For example, there is no link between the number and the tone height, so it's completely arbitrary. Unlike with the tone marks, where you can see how the tone is pronounced, at least with some guidance, you're out of luck with the numbers. You have to know that the first tone is pronounced in a certain way, and then you can label it 1, and then you label the second tone 2, and so on. And for someone who has studied Chinese or taught Chinese for a very long time, this is so automatic that we don't need to think about it. But for beginners, this can be rather tricky. It is an extra layer between the pronunciation and the writing. You have to think, hey, which is the first tone? Oh, the first tone, it was the high flat tone. So there's an extra step there, which is rather unnecessary sometimes. Just like with tone marks, we don't see the tone changes here usually. People write 1, 2, 3, 4 for the tones and assume you know how to apply tonesandi. And then the third drawback is that it's not standard in any system in common use today. So this is not what you're supposed to do in almost any case. You can of course still use it on your own or for your students if you think it's good or for convenience, but it's not standard in, say, Pinyin or something like that. Let's move on to number 3, which is Zhao tone numerals. And tone numerals sound rather similar to tone numbers, and that's no accident. They both involve numbers, but we can't call them the same thing because then it would be even more confusing. These numerals were introduced by the famous Chinese linguist Zhao Yuanren to show tone height and tone contours using a numbered system from 1 to 5, with 1 being the lowest tone and 5 being the highest. By adding more than one number, a tone contour can be indicated. So a rising tone in Mandarin, for example, would be 3-5, so that's mid-high, so it starts mid and then rises. And a falling tone is 5-1, so it starts at the very highest and goes to the very bottom. These numbers are also usually written in superscript, so for example, wen, as in zhongwen, would be written wen 3-5 in superscript. And to take another example, mi would be written mi 5-1 to indicate a falling tone. It's worth pointing out here that there can be some confusion because linguists studying other languages, such as Mesoamerican and African languages, sometimes uses a similar scale, but in reverse. So you have 5 being the lowest tone and 1 being the highest. And this can be confusing sometimes, but if you only stick to Chinese, you are safe because 1 is always the lowest and 5 always means the highest. So why would we use a system like this over one of the simpler ones we looked at first? Well, the obvious advantage here is that we can show how the tones are actually pronounced here. So if we take a word like 想要, we have a low 想. And this can be indicated, we can write it with a 2-1, which would be mid-low to low, so low falling essentially, 想要, and we can indicate that. And if we have another word like 想法, we can write that as 3-5 on the first syllable, meaning that it rises. So we can indicate these ways the tones are actually pronounced in context with a system like this. Another pro with this way of doing it is that there is a clear link between tone height and number. The higher the number, the higher the pitch. And once you know that, you can intuitively see how something is pronounced without having to look it up or listen or learn some arbitrary rules. Another advantage, which is usually not so important for students, but can be very important for researchers and teachers, is that you can use this kind of system to indicate when something is wrong. So for example, if I want to show the incorrect pronunciation of a third tone, I can write some arbitrary combination of numbers that describes this pronunciation. I'm not stuck with just 4 different categories or something like that. I can write something that isn't the standard tone in Mandarin. Maybe I want to indicate that someone doesn't start high enough on a fourth tone, and then you can write that as 3-1 instead of 5-1, indicating that the fall isn't starting high enough. Naturally, not everybody uses a system like this, so it is rarely used, which is a con in itself, because people will not usually understand what you mean unless they have some background in phonetics. Yes, it is easy to explain, but you still need to explain it. Another problem I mentioned earlier is that it can be confused with tone numbers. So if you see something with just a 1 on it, does that indicate that it's a low tone, or does it indicate that it is a first tone? Well, who knows? Normally, when you write with tone numerals, like we're talking about here, you tend to write more than 1 though. So if you're writing a high tone, you write 5-5 rather than just 5, which gets rid of this confusion. Another drawback is, of course, that in most cases you don't need to be this detailed. It's enough to say that something is a first tone. You don't need to know the exact pitch. Moving on to number 4, which is IPA tone letters. So IPA here is the International Phonetic Alphabet. Tone letters are a way of mapping tones to the height of a line of text, so allowing for visual representation of tones in running text. Zhao added a vertical bar as a reference, so with this system we get 5 basic marks. So each consists of a line, vertical line on the right, and then on the left you have a little line, a horizontal one, depending on the tone height. So a low tone has a low one, a low mid-tone has a slightly higher one, a mid-tone has a line in the middle, a high mid-tone has it slightly above that, and the high tone has it at the very top. And it's a little bit hard to describe these precisely in spoken language, so please refer to the written article if you want to know what these look like. This wouldn't be all that useful on its own, but the nice thing is that these can be combined with each other to form tone contours. So for example, for the first tone, you can put 2 high marks next to each other and becomes a high flat tone. You can then for the second tone have a mid-tone plus a high tone and you get a slope upwards, which looks like the second tone mark in Pinyin. Then you can also do the same thing with the other tones. But the nice thing here is that you can combine them in any way you want. So if you want to write some other tone, or you want to describe how someone pronounces a certain word, even if it's outside of the standard, you can do so. It's also very easy to indicate, say, a low tone or a dipping tone for the third tone, for example, or if you want to indicate some other variation. You can also represent the neutral tone simply by having a dot next to this vertical bar instead of a line. So let's have a look at the pros and cons of using IPA tone letters. So the biggest advantage is that this is an intuitive visual representation of tone height. Just like the tone marks in Pinyin, they represent tones directly, so you can see if something is a rising tone, a falling tone, or and so on. Except that now you can really see if it's supposed to be a dipping tone, just a low tone, or something else. So you can indicate tone sound, the tone change very easily. Since this is more or less a visual way of using the tone numerals we talked about earlier, this can also be used to indicate incorrect pronunciation. Finally, this is a standard, and it is the standard in IPA, so this is how tones are normally written. Naturally, there are several reasons why most people don't use this, and you might never have seen this unless you've studied phonetics. And the first one is that it's incredibly hard to type, and normally you shouldn't bother unless you're a phonetician or write papers in phonetics. Just copy-paste if you need them. Since special fonts might sometimes be required to show the tone letters correctly, it also runs the risk of other people seeing something other than what you intended to type, which can be very annoying sometimes. Finally, the last disadvantage is that tone letters are rarely used outside phonology and phonetics. Moving on to number 5, which is colors. The concept is rather straightforward, just use one color for each tone. Color has been used to represent tones in Mandarin for a long time, and there are now many rivaling color schemes. While the advantages are not as clear as they might seem at first, color can make tones clearer, provided that you get completely familiar with one and only one system. In episode 34 of the podcast, we talked specifically about using colors for tones, and I discussed many of the pros and cons there, so I will not go into too much detail here. I will just go through the basics in the context of this episode. But if you want to know more, I'll put a link in the description. One of the major pros with using color is that it can combine with almost any other system, including Chinese characters themselves. You don't even need to have a transcription of the syllables, you can just add color to the characters. They are also visually easy to identify, they stand out, at least for most people with normal color vision. And finally, the tone is also integrated into the syllable. Because if you think about it, one of the drawbacks of all the systems I've talked about so far is that tone appears to be something that is added to a syllable. Either it's a number afterwards, it's some kind of symbol afterwards, or it's a diacritic mark at the top of the syllable, or something like that. But it is something extra. But when you use color, it is integrated. The whole syllable is colored, or the whole character is colored. The tone is everywhere, and that's the way it should be. Another advantage with using color is that they lend themselves very well to mnemonics or memory devices. So if you have a certain character being blue, that's easy to remember because you can associate it with water or something else that is blue. And if a character is red, you can make other associations, maybe with fire, to aid memory. And this can be very powerful. I've put a link in the description to an article where I talk about using color to remember, say, tones, for example. Still, there are reasons why people don't use color all the time to represent tones. And the first one is that the link between tones and colors is rather arbitrary. There is nothing inherent in the color red that says it should be a fourth tone or first tone or something else. And this means that there are many different color schemes, and nothing is more confusing than learning several systems or mixing them up. So if you're going to use this as a student, make sure you only use one system and stick to it. If you're a teacher, you need to make sure that your students either have no connection with the colors and tones since before, meaning probably that they are zero beginners, then you can use your own color scheme or select one. But if you're teaching people who might have had previous systems before or learned something else, just don't do it because it's extremely confusing. Beyond this, we also have the problem that this is not standard in any system, and this is of course part of the confusion. There is no one standard, there are like 10 different ones. And what one creator thinks is intuitive is not intuitive to others. Naturally, as was the case with tone numbers and tone marks, we can also only use this to categorize the tones as tone 1, 2, 3, 4. We cannot really use it to show whether a third tone is a low tone or a rising tone in a specific case, for example. Moving on to number 6, which is 国语罗马字. And this romanization system, which was also created by Zhao, and maybe now you start realizing why he is such an important person in the history of Chinese linguistics, and we have just barely scratched at the contributions that he's made. But this system is not something that has stuck around, as opposed to the other things we've mentioned, but it is still relevant talking about here because it has a very unique feature when it comes to tones. The main idea is that since tones are an integral part of Chinese syllables, they should be integrated into the spelling of the word. Just like we did with colors before, it shouldn't be something that's added, it should be something integral to the word itself. So if I were to write 中文, for example, in this system, it would be Jongwen. And to someone who doesn't know about this, it just looks like no tones are included, but they actually are. I will not explain the full system here because it is rather intricate, and you can head over to the Wikipedia article if you are interested, but in general, the first tone is used as a basic form of a word, and then you change the spelling of the word depending on which tone you want, other than the first tone. So I'm going to use the syllable chang here as an example. That's C-H-A-N-G in Pinyin. And in GR, this is spelled C-H-A-N-G, exactly like in Pinyin when it's the first tone. When it's the second tone, it's spelled C-H-A-R-N-G. And when it's the third tone, you double the vowel, so it's C-H-A-A-N-G. And when it's the fourth tone, you turn the G into a Q, and that, you get C-H-A-N-Q. And when it's a neutral tone, you put a dot in front of it. So you see, there are no diacritic marks, there are no numbers here, but there are various ways of manipulating the spelling of the syllable to indicate the tone. This has certain advantages that I have already mentioned actually. For example, it's integrated into the syllable. The tone is not something extra added on top. So similar to colors, in other words. Furthermore, there are no special symbols required. You can just type with letters and a dot, and that's very easy and very fast. That being said, there are also many drawbacks with this system. For example, it's mostly arbitrary. I assume that Zhao, when he created this, chose spelling rules that made sense to him, but to me at least, as a modern Swedish person learning and teaching Chinese, The only one that I think is very intuitive is the doubling of the vowel for a third tone. That one I can make sense of, but the adding of R, turning G's into Q's, and otherwise changing the spelling of finals and so on, that isn't really something you can just intuit. You need to really learn these spelling rules. And they are very complex compared to any of the other systems we've mentioned here. Much more complex than Pinyin, of course. There are also many irregularities because the spelling doesn't change in a predictable way. So, for example, we saw that we added an R into chang to make it into chang. But you don't do that with all the second tones. Sometimes you do other things. Sometimes you change the final and so on, which makes it rather tricky. And the final drawback is that it's almost never used. Most people don't know about the system even though I do think it is interesting as an experiment. And I do appreciate the effort of making tones integrated into the syllables themselves. Finally, we've reached the seventh and final system we're going to look at, and that is totally orthographic pinyin, or TOP. This system was introduced by Terry Waltz with the goal of creating a system that is as transparent as possible for students. The full version uses tone marks from standard Pinyin and a color scheme, but the new innovation here is to use the size of the letters to indicate tone height. So uppercase means high and lowercase means low. So for example, the first tone is written with all uppercase letters, and the second tone is written with uppercase letters at the end. So if we were to write Zhongwen here, it would be Zhong, all caps, and then WE, lowercase, and then uppercase N to indicate the rising tone of Wen. Neutral tones are marked with an asterisk, since if you use all lowercase letters, that's used to indicate a low tone. Like I said, Waltz suggests that you use this with tone marks from Pinyin and with colors, but here I'm mostly interested in using uppercase and lowercase letters to represent high and low tones, rather than the colors or the tone marks, because we've already talked about those. So the pros with a system like this is that the tone is integrated into the syllable. You don't need something extra, and it's not something that's added to a syllable. So in that way you get the benefits of GR, but without having all the messy spelling rules. I would also say that it's rather clear and intuitive as soon as you understand the principle. You don't need explanations, so in that sense it mirrors the tone marks. And it can be used to indicate actual pronunciation. So for example, you can write all lowercase in xiang yao to show that xiang is a low tone. The only real drawback is that this is very rarely used, and I think most people haven't heard about this method, but of course, hopefully through this podcast episode, more people will. I think it has some clever aspects that are particularly useful for teachers, even though it is of course overkill for most people in most situations. I would also suggest that you modify the system to suit your needs. Like I said, I'm not too fond of using colors unless I'm dealing with complete beginners, because they might have learned other color schemes and then they will be very thoroughly confused. Okay, so let's wrap this up. Is there one system to rule them all? Is one of them better than the others? Well, tones are complex, so no wonder that people have come up with a plethora of ways of writing them down. There are even more methods than the ones I've shown here, such as the old system from Middle Chinese that is sometimes used in modern Chinese too. You might, for example, hear people talk about the first tone as yin ping, and the second tone as yang ping, the third tone as shang, and the fourth tone as qu. There are also more obscure systems I haven't found or decided to exclude for some reason or other. So is there a best way to write down tones? Well, that depends on the purpose of writing these tones, of course. If you just want to show someone who knows Chinese what tone a syllable has, most of the methods shown here are massive overkill. Just a number or a tone mark is enough. If you're teaching complete beginners, then the situation is quite different. Your goal is to teach them pronunciation rather than just let them know which tone a syllable should have. If you are a phonetician, you need to be able to write about tones more precisely than most of the commonly used systems allow for. So as we can see, depending on if you're a student, a teacher, a phonetician, or maybe something else, which system is best for you will depend on the situation and your needs. I think all the systems I've discussed today have some merit and can be used in particular situations. My hope is that by discussing various ways of writing tones, you will be able to find a way that suits your needs, whether you're a student or a teacher. So which of these tones do you like the best? Or is there maybe one that you really can't stand? Please let me know by heading over to Hacking Chinese and leaving a comment. And of course, if you know about some fancy, interesting, or otherwise worthwhile system for writing down tones that I haven't mentioned here, please let me know. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.